The rough fabric of the orange jumpsuit scratched against Zora Vance's skin, a constant, humiliating reminder that her life was over. Just 2 days ago, she was the untouchable strategist at Kang Industries, the only woman Kang Dae-Hyun ever let close. Now, she was shivering in a cold cell, framed by the very people she trusted. They waited until the boss was out of the country to plant the evidence, thinking that locking Zora away would break his empire. But they miscalculated. They didn't just jail an employee. They took the queen of a Korean Mafia boss. And Dae-Hyun doesn't file appeals. He burns cities. Zora is behind bars, but the war is already here. If you believe she deserves justice, hit that like button and subscribe to Afro Obsession right now, because the rescue is going to be legendary. The betrayal didn't begin with a shout. It began with a whisper in the dead of night. 12 hours before the police stormed the building, the 35th floor of Kang Industries was silent, bathed in the soft blue glow of standby monitors. Clara, the vice president of operations, moved through the shadows of the executive wing like a phantom. She had smiled in Zora's face for 3 years, sharing lunch orders and complaining about difficult clients, all while nursing a bitterness that had rotted her from the inside out. With a swipe of a stolen keycard, she slipped into Zora's office. Her hands didn't shake. This was precise. This was calculated. She taped a small, black encryption drive beneath the mahogany desk, simple, clumsy enough to be found, but hidden enough to look intentional. Then, she sat at Zora's terminal, typing in the passcode she had memorized from over Zora's shoulder weeks ago. Clara initiated the transfer. Millions of dollars in company cryptocurrency began to bleed out of the secure accounts, routed through a maze of servers before settling into a wallet that would be traced directly back to Zora Vance. Clara watched the progress bar hit 100%, her reflection in the dark screen twisting into a smirk of pure malice. "Goodbye, Queen," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the hum of the air conditioning. The next morning, Zora walked into the office feeling the weight of the city on her shoulders, but she welcomed it. With Kang Dae-Hyun in Seoul finalizing the merger, she was the acting authority, the proxy for his will. She set her iced coffee on the coaster, straightened her blazer, and looked at the empty leather chair behind the massive glass desk. She missed him, not just the boss who challenged her intellect, but the man whose subtle touches had started to burn through her professional resolve. She opened her laptop, ready to review the quarterly projections, completely unaware that she was already standing on a trapdoor that had been unlatched hours ago. The chaos arrived at 10:15 a.m. It wasn't the building's security that came for her. It was the cybercrimes unit. The elevator doors slid open with a heavy, ominous chime, and 6 officers in tactical vests marched through the bullpen. The silence that fell over the floor was instant and suffocating. Zora stood up, her brow furrowed in confusion rather than fear. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady. "You can't just barge into." Zora Vance. The lead officer didn't even look at her face. His eyes were fixed on her desk. He didn't ask her to step aside. He shoved past her, dropping to one knee. He didn't search the room. He didn't check the filing cabinets. He reached directly under the desk and pulled out the black drive. The blood drained from Zora's face. The precision of it, the way he knew exactly where to look, hit her harder than the handcuffs that were suddenly snapped around her wrists. "I've never seen that before," she stammered, the panic finally piercing her composure. "That's not mine. You have to listen to me." But they weren't listening. They were reciting her rights, a drone of legal monotone that blurred with the gasps of her co-workers. As they marched her out, Zora caught a glimpse of Clara standing near the break room, her hand covering her mouth in feigned shock, but her eyes cold and triumphant. The interrogation room was a sensory deprivation tank of gray walls and stale coffee. Zora had been sitting there for hours, her wrists aching, her mind racing in jagged loops. The detective across from her tossed a thick file onto the metal table. It slid across the surface with a harsh scrape. "We have the logs, Ms. Vance. We have the drive with your fingerprints, or rather, the lack of them, because you wiped it. But you missed the metadata." "I didn't do it," Zora said, her voice trembling but her chin high. "I am the chief strategist. Why would I steal from the man who gave me everything?" "Maybe you got greedy," the detective sneered, leaning in close. Or maybe you knew he was coming back to fire you. It doesn't matter. The money is in an account linked to your ID. The drive was under your desk. You're looking at 20 years, Zora. He leaned back, crossing his arms. Unless you give us the encryption keys to the rest of the funds. Help us, and maybe you don't die in prison. Zora stared at the reflection in the two-way mirror, seeing a woman she barely recognized, bruised by the rough arrest, exhausted, and utterly alone. She realized then that this wasn't just a frame job. It was an execution. They had stripped her of her name, her freedom, and her reputation in a single morning. But as the tears threatened to spill again, she thought of Dae-Hyun. He would see the flaws in this. He would know. I want my lawyer, she whispered, the steel returning to her spine. And when Kang Dae-Hyun lands, you better pray you have more than a planted drive. The tires of the Gulfstream G650 screeched against the tarmac, a harsh sound that signaled Kang Dae-Hyun's return to the city he practically owned. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the motion precise and controlled, just like everything else in his life. The merger in Seoul had been a bloodbath, but he had emerged victorious, acquiring a competitor for pennies on the dollar. Yet, as he descended the jet's stairs into the gray, overcast afternoon, he felt no sense of triumph. He checked his phone for the third time since landing. No messages. No missed calls. Zora always texted him when he landed, a simple welcome back, or a status update on the markets. Today, the screen was black, a silent void that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. His driver, a stoic man named Kenji, held the door of the black SUV open, his face unusually pale. "Welcome home, sir," Kenji murmured, his eyes darting away quickly. "Where is she?" Dae-Hyun asked, sliding into the leather seat. He didn't need to specify a name. There was only one person who mattered enough to greet him at the hangar. "Miss Vance was unavailable, sir," Kenji replied, closing the door before Dae-Hyun could press for details. The drive to the Kang Industries tower was suffocating. Dae-Hyun stared out the tinted window, watching the skyline blur, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Zora wasn't unavailable. She was the most reliable force in his universe. If she wasn't answering, something was wrong. When he walked into the lobby of Kang Industries, the atmosphere changed instantly. The usual hum of productivity died. Heads bowed low over keyboards. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. It was the silence of a kingdom that knew the king had returned to a crime scene. Dae-Hyun strode past the reception desk, his footsteps echoing like gunshots on the marble. He didn't stop for the elevator. He took the private lift directly to the 35th floor. As the door slid open, he expected to see her there, standing by the glass wall with her tablet, ready to debrief him on the week's numbers. He expected the faint scent of her vanilla orchid perfume to calm the storm brewing inside him. Instead, the office was empty. Her desk was cleared. The dual monitors were dark. The personal touches, the framed photo of her mother, the small succulent she kept by her keyboard, were gone. It looked as if Zora Vance had never existed. Dae-Hyun walked into his own office, the heavy oak doors swinging open with a groan. Sitting squarely in the center of his desk was a single white envelope. His name was typed on the front. He didn't sit down. He picked up the envelope, his gloved thumb tracing the sharp edge of the paper before ripping it open. "Dear Mr. Kang, please accept this letter as my formal resignation, effective immediately. The pressure of the position has become too much to bear, and I have decided to pursue opportunities elsewhere. I regret the suddenness of this departure." Dae-Hyun read the words once, then twice. A low, terrifying laugh escaped his throat. It was a sound devoid of humor, sharp enough to cut glass. The syntax was wrong. The tone was pathetic. Zora didn't regret. She didn't buckle under pressure. She thrived on it. She was the woman who had stared down hostile board members without blinking. She was the woman who had stood by his side when his enemies threatened to burn the building down. This wasn't a resignation letter. It was a forgery, and a lazy one at that. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the veins in his hand bulging against the fabric of his glove. They had taken her. Someone had been foolish enough to think that a piece of paper would satisfy him, that he would simply accept her disappearance and move on. He dropped the balled-up letter onto the desk and looked up, his reflection in the window showing a man who was no longer a CEO, but something far more dangerous. He pressed the intercom button on his desk, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Get security up here. Now. And find out who logged into her terminal last night. The search for Zora Vance hadn't just begun. It was already a hunt. The boardroom of Kang Industries was designed to intimidate, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table long enough to seat 20. But today, the room felt less like a center of commerce and more like a tomb. Dae-Hyun stood at the head of the table, his back to the view, his silhouette cut sharp against the gray light. Seated before him were the 6 people who made up his inner circle, the VPs, the head of security, and the chief financial officer. Clara sat near the end, her hands folded primly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the polished wood. The air was so thin it felt hard to breathe. Dae-Hyun didn't speak for a long time. He simply let the silence stretch, heavier and heavier, until the CFO cleared his throat nervously. That was the trigger. Dae-Hyun turned, his movement fluid and predatory. He didn't look at the CFO. He looked at the resignation letter lying in the center of the table. You expect me to believe, Dae-Hyun began, his voice dangerously soft, that Zora Vance, a woman who built this company's Western division from the ground up, resigned via a typed letter left on my desk like a coward? And that she did this 3 hours before she was arrested for embezzlement. Sir, the head of security stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. The evidence was conclusive. The cybercrimes unit found the drive. We had no choice but to cooperate. It was a direct violation of protocol. Dae-Hyun walked slowly down the length of the table. The sound of his dress shoes on the floor was the only noise in the room. He stopped behind the head of security's chair. Protocol, he repeated, tasting the word like poison. You speak to me of protocol when you let my strategist be dragged out of this building in handcuffs without calling me. He suddenly grabbed the back of the man's chair and spun it around. The heavy leather screech was deafening. Dae-Hyun leaned down, his face inches from the trembling man. The mask of the CEO slipped, revealing the face of the man who had survived the Seoul Underground. You didn't call me because you were told not to. You didn't check the security logs because you knew what you would find. Dae-Hyun straightened up and signaled to Kenji, who stood by the double doors. The lock clicked shut with a metallic finality that made 2 of the executives flinch. Dae-Hyun pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and picked up the resignation letter. He flicked the flame to life. This letter is a lie, he said, holding the corner of the paper until it caught fire. He dropped the burning page onto the mahogany table. No one dared to move to put it out. They watched the lie turn to ash. Zora didn't steal from me, Dae-Hyun stated, his voice rising, resonating with a terrifying authority. Someone in this room used her credentials. Someone in this room planted that drive. And someone in this room called the police before the transfer was even complete. His dark eyes swept the table, lingering for a fraction of a second on Clara, who had gone pale. You think you removed an obstacle. You think because I wear a suit now, I have forgotten how to handle traitors. He slammed his hand onto the table, the sound cracking like a whip. This is not a corporate investigation anymore. This is personal. You have 1 hour. If I don't have the name of the person who authorized the police entry and the location of where they are holding her, I will strip this company to the studs. And for the traitors sitting among you. He let the threat hang there, heavy and violent. Pray the police keep her. Because if I find you first, prison will be a mercy. The visitation room at the county detention center was designed to strip away hope. It was a long, sterile corridor divided by a wall of reinforced plexiglass, smelling faintly of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies. But when Kang Dae-Hyun walked in, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with a predatory energy that made the guards near the door shift uncomfortably in their uniforms. He didn't look like a visitor. He looked like an invasion. His tailored black suit absorbed the harsh fluorescent light, and his eyes, cold and scanning, dissected every inch of the room until they landed on the door on the other side of the glass. He didn't sit. He stood before the designated booth, his hands balling into fists at his sides, waiting for them to bring her out. When the heavy steel door finally buzzed open, the breath caught in Dae-Hyun's throat. Zora stepped into the booth, and the sight of her nearly shattered his composure. She was wearing a faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her frame, a grotesque contrast to the silk blouses and tailored blazers she usually wore. Her hair, usually pulled back in a sharp, professional bun, was loose and frayed. But it was her eyes that enraged him the most. They were rimmed with red, dull and cast downward, refusing to meet his. She looked broken. She looked like she expected him to yell, to demand answers, to look at her with the same suspicion the police had shown. She sat down slowly on the metal stool, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. Dae-Hyun moved instantly. He sat, grabbing the black receiver phone and pressing it to his ear. His movement was so sharp it made Zora flinch, her gaze finally snapping up to meet his. For a second, the world outside the booth vanished. There was no prison, no guards, no conspiracy, just the terrifying silence between them. Zora picked up her phone with trembling fingers, her voice barely a whisper through the crackling line. Dae-Hyun, I swear to you, I didn't take it. The desperation in her voice tore at him. Stop, he commanded, not harshly, but with a firmness that cut through her panic. You don't need to defend yourself to me. Not ever. Zora blinked, a fresh tear tracking through the grime on her cheek. But the evidence, the drive was in my desk. They said. I don't care what they said, Dae-Hyun interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a dangerous intensity. I know who you are, Zora. I know your mind. I know your loyalty. And I know you didn't do this. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers, demanding her total attention. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pressed his palm flat against the cold glass that separated them. It was a gesture of longing, a futile attempt to bridge the distance, to offer a touch that the law forbade. Zora stared at his hand, her breath hitching. Slowly, she raised her own hand, matching his palm against the glass. Their fingers aligned perfectly, separated only by an inch of bulletproof transparency. The heat of his gaze seemed to burn right through the barrier. Zora, look at me, Dae-Hyun said, his voice steady, a calm before the storm. She locked eyes with him, seeing the darkness swirling there, not directed at her, but at the world that had hurt her. You are not going to stay in here. Do you hear me? I don't care about the police. I don't care about the courts. His fingers tightened against the glass, turning white at the knuckles. This prison won't hold you, because I'm going to burn down the man who built it. I will find the person who put you in this suit, and I will make them beg for the mercy they didn't show you. For the first time in 48 hours, the fear in Zora's eyes receded, replaced by the reflection of his resolve. She nodded, a small, fragile movement. Get me out, Dae-Hyun, she whispered. I'm already at war, Zora, he promised, his thumb tracing the glass where her cheek would be. Just hold on. I'm coming for you. Dae-Hyun loosened his tie as the heavy steel gates of the detention center slid shut behind the black SUV. It was the first time in 5 years he had felt the need to breathe without the constriction of his civilized mask. The man who had walked into the prison was a CEO. The man leaving it was the head of the Jumpsuit syndicate. He picked up his secure phone, the one that never connected to a cell tower registered in his name. Kenji, he said, his voice void of emotion. Take us to the black site. And wake the wolves. Kenji nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew what that meant. They weren't going back to the glass tower of Kang Industries. They were going to the underground server farm in the meatpacking district, the nerve center Dae-Hyun kept for problems that legal teams couldn't solve. The site was a fortress of humming servers and dimly lit screens, smelling of ozone and stale coffee. When Dae-Hyun entered, 5 people stood up. Men and women who didn't exist in any government database. These were the sleepers, hackers, and enforcers who owed Dae-Hyun their lives. They waited for his command with bated breath. I want the judge, Dae-Hyun commanded, throwing his jacket onto a chair and rolling up his sleeves, revealing the edge of the Irizumi tattoo on his forearm. Judge Sterling signed Zora's warrant in record time. I want to know who paid him. I want to know where he eats, where he sleeps, and what dark secrets he keeps in his closet. A young woman with tattooed fingers began typing furiously, the clacking of keys the only sound in the room. Already on it, boss. Sterling's accounts are encrypted, but he got a massive crypto deposit 3 hours before the raid. Routing it now, bouncing through the Caymans, hitting a shell company in Singapore. She paused, her eyes widening as the code cascaded down her screen. Boss, the origin wallet. It's linked to a burner phone pinging from a penthouse on the east side. Whose penthouse? Dae-Hyun asked, leaning over her shoulder, his presence suffocating. It's registered to a shell corp, she said. But the geolocation matches the residence of Clara Yun. Dae-Hyun straightened, a cold, terrifying smile touching his lips. It was exactly as he suspected. Clara hadn't just acted out of jealousy. She had bought the law. She thought she was playing a corporate game, unaware she had just invited a predator into her home. And the judge? Sterling is at the Sapphire Club tonight. Another operative called out, pulling up a live security feed. Celebratory dinner, looks like. Celebratory, Dae-Hyun repeated, the word tasting like ash. He is celebrating burying my queen while he drinks scotch purchased with blood money. He walked to the gun rack on the far wall, selecting a matte black pistol. He checked the chamber with a metallic clack that echoed through the room. Kenji, get the extraction team ready. We aren't sending lawyers to the Sapphire Club. We are sending a message. He turned back to the hackers, his eyes burning with lethal intent. Burn Sterling's accounts. Delete his assets. By the time I walk through the doors of that club, I want him to be a pauper. And keep eyes on Clara. If she tries to leave the city, shut down the airport. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Phones were tapped, traffic lights were manipulated, and the digital noose began to tighten around the conspirators. Dae-Hyun holstered the weapon, his heart beating with a steady, lethal rhythm. The law had failed Zora. Now it was his turn. The war has officially begun. Comment, war, if you want to see Dae-Hyun unleash his full power for Zora. We're halfway through. Don't go anywhere. The best is yet to come. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Onyx Tower, masking the sound of the glass cutter slicing a perfect circle through the reinforced pane on the 42nd floor. While Clara was busy toasting to her victory across town, Dae-Hyun's wolves were at her door. Kenji swung into the darkened apartment, his movements silent and fluid, followed closely by two specialists clad in tactical black. They weren't looking for jewelry or cash. They were hunting for the insurance policy every trader keeps, the original, unaltered files. Clear, Kenji whispered into his comms, his voice vibrating in Dae-Hyun's earpiece. Dae-Hyun sat in the mobile command unit parked 3 blocks away, staring at the blueprints of Clara's penthouse on a glowing monitor. His face was a mask of cold concentration. You have 3 minutes before the silent alarm resets, he warned, his eyes tracking the red blip of the security patrol moving in the lobby below. Find the safe. Inside the apartment, the team moved with surgical precision. They bypassed the obvious wall safe in the master bedroom. That was a decoy. Instead, Kenji moved to the temperature-controlled wine cellar. He ran a thermal scanner over the back wall, the blue light washing over the expensive vintages until it hit a patch of heat behind a rack of Merlot. Found it, Kenji muttered. He pressed a suction device to the false panel, popping it open to reveal a biometric keypad. Bypassing now, the hacker back in the van announced, her fingers flying across her keyboard. I'm looping the biometric feed, injecting a spoofed print, and you're in. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. Inside lay a single, silver external hard drive and a burner phone. Kenji grabbed them, plugging a wireless transmitter into the drive's port. Uploading the file structure now, boss. Verifying contents. The tension in the command unit was suffocating. Dae-Hyun leaned forward, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. 50%. 75%. If this drive was empty, or if it was encrypted with a key they couldn't crack, Zora stayed in prison. But then, the file names popped up. Project__frame, Sterling_payment_ledger, and most damning of all, a folder labeled original_CCTV. Open the video, Dae-Hyun commanded. The footage flickered to life. It was grainy, black and white security footage from inside Zora's office. It showed the timestamp, 2 a.m. It showed Clara entering, taping the drive under the desk, and logging into Zora's terminal. It was irrefutable. It was the smoking gun. We have it, Kenji said, pulling the drive and the phone. We have everything. Get out, Dae-Hyun said, a wave of dark, vindictive satisfaction washing over him. Leave no trace. I want her to think she's safe until the moment I crush her. As the team rappelled back into the stormy night, vanishing like ghosts, Dae-Hyun unplugged his headset. He looked at the freeze frame of Clara's face on the monitor, then closed his eyes for a brief moment, picturing Zora behind the glass. The heist was over. The evidence was secured. The hunt was no longer about finding the truth. It was about delivering the punishment. He tapped the driver on the shoulder. "Take me to the Sapphire Club," he said, checking the magazine of his pistol. "I have a judge to visit." The champagne in Clara's system made the city lights below look like smeared jewels. She stepped out of the private elevator and into her penthouse, humming a soft tune, the taste of victory sweet on her tongue. The board had been receptive to her interim leadership pitch at dinner, and Zora Vance was rotting in a cell. It was, by all accounts, the perfect crime. She tossed her keys onto the marble console table and reached for the light switch, expecting the warm glow of her living room to greet her. But the lights didn't flicker. The room remained swallowed in shadows, save for the ambient glow of the skyline filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I wouldn't bother," a voice said from the darkness. It was low, smooth, and terrified her to her core. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the switch. Sitting in the high-backed armchair facing the window was a silhouette she knew better than her own. Kang Dae-Hyun didn't turn around immediately. He took a sip from a glass of her finest whiskey, the ice clinking softly in the terrified silence. "Dae-Hyun," Clara stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to summon the corporate persona that had served her so well. "You can't just break into my home. This is trespassing. I'll call security." "Security isn't coming, Clara. And neither is Judge Sterling." Dae-Hyun finally stood up, turning slowly to face her. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, revealing eyes that held no trace of the professional colleague she had known for years. These were the eyes of a predator who had cornered a wounded animal. He tossed a small, silver object onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. It was the encryption drive. Next to it, he placed her burner phone. Clara's breath hitched. She took a step back, her back hitting the cold wall. That's illegal evidence. You can't use that in court. It's inadmissible." Dae-Hyun laughed, a dry, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. He walked toward her, closing the distance with predatory grace. "You still think we are playing by corporate rules," he murmured, stopping inches from her face. The smell of expensive cologne and gun oil radiated off him. "You think this is about human resources or board meetings? You made a mistake, Clara. You didn't just frame an employee. You stole my heart. You took Zora." He slammed his hand against the wall beside her head, trapping her. Clara flinched, a whimper escaping her throat. "Please," she whispered, her facade crumbling completely. I can fix it. I can tell them it was a mistake." "It's too late for mistakes," Dae-Hyun hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "My team has already emptied your offshore accounts. The footage of you planting the drive is currently playing on the loop in the police commissioner's inbox. Judge Sterling is already in custody, singing like a bird to save his own skin." He leaned in closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. "I didn't come here to fire you, Clara. I came here to watch you realize that you have lost everything. Your money, your reputation, your freedom. It's all gone, burnt to ash, just like you tried to burn her." The sound of sirens began to wail from the street below, growing louder with every second. Red and blue lights washed over the walls of the penthouse, illuminating Clara's tear-streaked face. Dae-Hyun stepped back, straightening his lapels with a look of utter disgust. "The police are at the elevator," he said coldly, turning his back on her. "Do not speak Zora's name when they question you. You are not worthy of it." He walked toward the shadows of the rear exit, leaving her collapsing to the floor as the elevator doors chimed, signaling the end of her life and the beginning of his justice. The walk to the district attorney's office felt like a march to the gallows. Zora's wrists were chafed raw beneath the metal cuffs, and every step she took in the orange jumpsuit felt heavy with dread. 2 guards flanked her, their faces impassive, guiding her not toward the visitation block, but toward the administrative wing. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. Had they moved the hearing up? Was she being transferred to a federal facility before she could even speak to her lawyer? She kept her head down, staring at the polished linoleum, trying to steel herself for whatever new nightmare awaited her. When the heavy oak door swung open, the first thing Zora noticed was the silence. The usual chaotic din of the legal offices was gone. Inside, District Attorney Miller sat behind his massive desk, looking smaller and paler than she had ever seen a man of his stature. He wasn't working. He was sweating, his eyes darting nervously to the figure standing by the window. Kang Dae-Hyun turned slowly. The morning light framed him in a halo of terrifying perfection. He wasn't wearing the disheveled look of a worried lover. He was dressed in a suit sharp enough to cut, looking like a king who had just conquered a hostile nation. The air in the room was thick with his presence, a suffocating aura of power that made the armed guards hesitate at the threshold. "Bring her in," Dae-Hyun commanded. He didn't look at the guards. He looked only at Zora. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the DA flinch. "And take those cuffs off. Now." "Sir, protocol dictates," one guard began, but he was cut off by a sharp sound from the desk. DA Miller had slammed his hand down, knocking over a pen holder. "Do as he says," Miller barked, his voice cracking. "Remove the restraints." Immediately, Zora stood frozen as the guard fumbled with the key. The metal clicked, and the cuffs fell away with a heavy clatter. She rubbed her wrists, looking from the terrified DA to Dae-Hyun, trying to process the shift in reality. "Dae-Hyun," she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of silence. "What is happening?" Dae-Hyun crossed the room in 3 long strides, ignoring everyone else. He stopped in front of her, his hand reaching out to cup her face, his thumb gently brushing away a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "I told you I would burn it down," he murmured, his eyes searching hers for injuries. Then, he turned his gaze back to the district attorney, his expression hardening into stone. "Tell her." Miller cleared his throat, shuffling a stack of papers with trembling hands. "Ms. Vance, new evidence has come to light. Specifically, unadulterated security footage and a confession regarding the planting of the encryption drive." He swallowed hard, unable to meet her eyes. "The state is dropping all charges against you, effective immediately. The dismissal is with prejudice. You cannot be retried for this. Misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," Dae-Hyun repeated, the word dripping with venom. He stepped toward the desk, and Miller actually recoiled into his chair. "You signed a warrant based on a forgery. You kept an innocent woman in a cage because it was politically convenient. Do not call it a misunderstanding. Call it what it is, a resignation." Zora watched in shock as Miller nodded rapidly, too terrified to argue. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was free. Not on bail, not pending trial. Free. The nightmare that had swallowed her life 48 hours ago had been dismantled, piece by piece, by the man standing beside her. Dae-Hyun turned back to her, the darkness in his eyes softening into something fierce and possessive. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "Let's go," he said, guiding her toward the door. "This place doesn't deserve your shadow." As they walked out, leaving the trembling DA and the stunned guards in their wake, Zora realized she wasn't just walking out of a prison. She was walking into a life where nothing and no one would ever dare to touch her again. The heavy steel gates of the detention center buzzed and slowly retracted, opening onto a world that Zora had feared she might never see again. The morning sun was blinding, but she didn't shield her eyes. She let the warmth wash over her face, breathing in the air that tasted of exhaust fumes and freedom. Beside her, Kang Dae-Hyun was a solid wall of presence, his hand firmly placed on the small of her back, guiding her forward with a possessiveness that dared anyone to challenge him. A chaotic sea of reporters and flashing cameras waited beyond the perimeter. The story of the framed executive and the ruthless CEO had leaked, sparking a media firestorm. As they stepped onto the pavement, the shouting began, a cacophony of questions about the embezzlement, the rival, and the scandal. Zora instinctively flinched, shrinking slightly against Dae-Hyun's side. Dae-Hyun stopped. He didn't rush her to the waiting line of black SUVs. Instead, he turned to face the mob. The movement was so abrupt, so radiating with authority, that the shouting died down into a hush of nervous anticipation. He looked directly into the lenses of the news cameras, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the broadcast signals. "Write this down," Dae-Hyun said, his voice carrying over the silence without the need to shout. Zora Vance is innocent. The people who conspired against her have been removed. The structures that allowed this to happen have been dismantled. He paused, his hand tightening protectively on Zora's shoulder, pulling her closer into his frame. Let there be no confusion in this city. Zora Vance stands under my protection. From this day forward, anyone who moves against her answers directly to me. And I do not offer second chances. He didn't wait for questions. He turned, guiding Zora toward the lead vehicle. Kenji held the door open, his head bowed in deep respect, not just for his boss, but for the woman who had survived the fire. Zora slid into the plush leather interior, the heavy door slamming shut and instantly sealing out the noise of the world. The sudden silence was overwhelming. Zora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for days, her trembling hands resting on her lap. Dae-Hyun didn't speak. He reached into the console and pulled out a bottle of water, twisting the cap off before handing it to her. Then, he took off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering the last of the orange jumpsuit. "It's over, Zora," he murmured, sliding across the seat to pull her into his arms. Zora buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of him, clean, sharp, and safe. The tears that came now weren't from fear, but from relief. She felt his lips press against the top of her head, a silent vow that the war he had started was finished, and he had won the only prize that mattered. As the convoy began to move, gliding smoothly back toward the skyline they now ruled together, Zora knew that nothing would ever be the same. She wasn't just an executive anymore. She was the queen of a king who had burned the world down just to bring her home. Justice has been served, and the queen is back on her throne. If you love Zora and Dae-Hyun's story, share this video with a friend who needs a protective hero in their life. Subscribe to Afroco Obsession for more stories of obsession, romance, and power. See you in the next one.